The sun hung low in the wide western sky, painting the land in gold and crimson. Dust swirled across the lonely trail as a middle-aged cowboy guided his horse toward home. His face was lined with years of sun, wind, and hardship, each wrinkle telling a story of battles fought, cattle driven, and nights spent under endless stars. He was known to the people in town simply as the Cowboy, for everyone respected him, though few really knew his heart. He was a man who had given his best years to survival in the Wild West, and in return he had gained both scars and wisdom. Life on the frontier had never been easy. Bandits roamed the prairies, storms ruined crops, and sometimes the law was as cruel as the land itself. But the cowboy had endured. He had once been a husband and a father in a small log cabin at the edge of town, raising his boy with steady hands and quiet pride. His wife had passed away many years earlier, leaving him to raise their son alone. He had done his best, though it meant long days in the saddle and lonely nights by the fire. His son had grown into a strong young man, brave enough to carve his own path, leaving home to work in distant territories. The cowboy missed him, but he was proud too. Fathers in the Wild West did not often speak of their feelings, but deep in his chest, his heart beat with quiet hope that his boy would remember the sacrifices made for him. That evening, as the cowboy dismounted at his ranch, he noticed the yard was not as quiet as usual. His son's horse was tied near the corral, and the cowboy's heart leapt at the sight. It had been months since the young man had come home, and the thought of hearing his voice again warmed the old cowboy more than the fire inside his cabin. He stepped inside and found his son standing tall, his eyes bright, wearing the dust of long travel. The reunion was strong but simple, firm handshakes, claps on the back, and a look that said more than words could carry. "I've brought you something." "Pa," the young man said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and mystery. He motioned to the yard, where a figure stood silently in the shadows. The cowboy followed his gaze, and there, tied loosely by a rope, stood a young Apache man. His dark eyes shone with defiance, his posture straight despite the roughness of his capture. His clothes were torn from travel, his wrists bound, but his spirit seemed unbroken. The cowboy frowned, his heart tightening in unease. The son explained how in a distant camp there had been conflict between settlers and Apache fighters. Some were captured and one was given to him as a prize. He told his father he wanted to show thanks for years of sacrifice. To him, this gift was a sign of gratitude, a token to prove his success. The cowboy listened, silent, his weathered hands gripping the wooden frame of the door. In the town and the harsh West of that time, such things were not rare. Men took what they could and often justified it by the rules of the frontier. Yet the cowboy, standing there with his steady gray eyes fixed on the young Apache, felt a heaviness in his chest. He saw not a gift, but a person. A man of strength, perhaps younger than his own son, with a history written in his scars and in the pride that refused to bend even in chains. The cowboy did not say much in that moment, for words were not always easy for him. He simply nodded, thanked his son for his thoughtfulness, but inside a storm was brewing. He had lived long enough to know that gratitude could never come through ownership. Still, he accepted the situation for now, for he did not wish to crush his son's spirit with harsh words on their first night together. The cowboy untied the rope and led the Apache to the barn. He offered him water, a blanket, and space in the corner where hay was stacked high. The young man did not speak, but his eyes never left the cowboy's face. There was suspicion there, anger too, but also curiosity. The cowboy spoke gently, telling him he meant no harm, though he was unsure if the Apache understood his words. Actions would speak louder in time. That night, as the cowboy sat by the fire with his son, he listened to stories of the boy's travels. The son spoke with excitement about ranches in the South, about traders and soldiers, about the rough lives of men who lived without fear. The cowboy smiled faintly, but his mind kept drifting back to the barn. He thought of the Apache lying on cold hay, of the pride in his son's voice when presenting him as a prize, and of the strange twist of fate that had brought them all together. The West was wild, full of harsh lessons, but this was one he had not expected. The next morning, the town buzzed when word spread. Some neighbors passed by the ranch to sneak glances at the Apache, their voices filled with curiosity and judgment. "So the old cowboy's got himself a servant now," one muttered. "Never thought he'd accept such a thing," said another. Some spoke with envy, others with mockery. The cowboy ignored them, though their words burned in his ears. He was a man who valued dignity above gossip, and he had no patience for small minds. Still, he knew the situation would stir more trouble than peace. As days passed, the cowboy continued his routines. He repaired fences, tended to cattle, and kept the ranch in order. Yet everywhere he turned, the Apache was there, watching, waiting, silent but steady. He worked when asked, carrying water, helping with horses, though his movements were more of duty than obedience. The cowboy could feel the weight of his pride in every gesture. He respected it, even admired it, though he never said so aloud. He found himself speaking more to the young man even when no reply came. He would point at tools, at the horizon, at the sky, and explain things in his plain, simple voice, as if trying to build a bridge where words could not yet travel. One evening, as the cowboy sat by the corral, he caught the Apache studying the stars. For the first time, their eyes met not as captor and captive, but as two men who had both known loss. It was a fleeting moment, but in it the cowboy saw something he had not expected. Strength not just of body, but of spirit. He wondered what stories lay behind those eyes, what paths had led the Apache here, and whether fate had tied them together for reasons neither of them yet understood. The cowboy was a man of the West, hardened by life but softened by a sense of honor. He could not yet explain why, but deep in his heart, he felt that this strange gift from his son was not the blessing it seemed, but perhaps a test of his values, his compassion, and the kind of man he truly wished to be. The morning sun spread across the ranch, casting long shadows on the dusty ground. The cowboy stepped out of his cabin, his boots crunching against the earth, and his eyes moved toward the barn where the Apache stayed. The young man was already awake, standing tall despite the rope loosely tied around one wrist. He had not run during the night, though nothing had truly stopped him from slipping away. That alone puzzled the cowboy. It told him that the Apache was not careless. He was waiting, watching, measuring every step and every man around him. The cowboy carried a tin cup of water and a piece of bread to him. The Apache accepted it silently. His hands were rough, scarred from years of survival, but his grip was steady as he took the food. His eyes, dark and sharp, studied the cowboy with quiet intensity. The cowboy did not know if the Apache understood his words, but he spoke anyway. "Eat. You'll need strength out here." His voice was calm, steady, neither commanding nor mocking. It was the kind of voice that came from a man who had seen too many hard seasons to waste energy on cruelty. Word of the Apache's presence had already spread further through town. Some men came to the ranch out of curiosity, peering at him as though he were no more than a spectacle. They whispered to each other, making comments about taming him, about how lucky the cowboy was to have such a strong worker at his side. The cowboy's jaw tightened each time he heard such talk, though he said little. He simply turned his back on their words and returned to his chores. Inside, though, he felt a stirring of anger, not toward the Apache, but toward those who could not see the man behind the bindings. As the days stretched into weeks, the Apache began to work more openly around the ranch. At first, his movements were slow, deliberate, as if testing the cowboy's patience. But soon his skill became clear. He handled horses with surprising ease, calming even the most restless mustangs with a gentle touch. He repaired a broken fence with methods the cowboy had never seen, weaving wood and rope in ways that were both strong and efficient. His knowledge of the land was sharp, too. He could look at the sky and sense if a storm was coming, or kneel by the dirt and know where water might be found. These were skills learned not from books but from generations of living close to the earth. The cowboy watched carefully. Each time the Apache displayed his skill, a quiet respect grew within him. He did not praise him aloud. Men of the West rarely spoke such words, but he began to treat him less like a prisoner and more like a partner in daily work. He stopped tying the rope at night, trusting that the Apache would not run. And indeed, the young man remained. Not out of submission, the cowboy suspected, but out of a silent curiosity that matched his own. The townsfolk, however, were less willing to accept this change. At the saloon, whispers turned to arguments. "He's keeping that Apache loose," one man growled over his whiskey. "Mark my words, it'll end in blood." Others laughed, saying the cowboy was too soft-hearted for his own good. Rumors spread that the Apache had killed men before, that he was dangerous, untrustworthy, a wild animal hiding behind human eyes. The cowboy heard the gossip when he went into town for supplies, but he brushed it aside. He had lived long enough to know that most men feared what they did not understand. Back on the ranch, a quiet shift was taking place. The cowboy began speaking more often to the Apache, pointing to objects, naming them slowly, repeating words until he was certain the young man grasped their meaning. "Horse," he would say, patting the animal's neck. "Water," as he handed him a canteen. The Apache listened, repeating some words in a low voice, his accent thick but his memory sharp. He also began to share fragments of his own tongue, simple words spoken with a low firmness as though testing if the cowboy had the patience to learn. Slowly, without books or teachers, a bridge of language began to form between them. The cowboy's son watched these changes with unease. He had expected his father to use the Apache as a servant, to take advantage of what had been given. Instead, he saw the two men working side by side, eating at the same table, and sometimes sitting in silence as equals before the fire. One evening, the son confronted his father. "Pa, you're treating him like a friend," he said with disbelief. "That's not what he's supposed to be." The cowboy fixed his son with a steady gaze. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "A man's worth isn't in what chains him, but in what he chooses to do. He may have been given to me as a gift, but I'll never see him as less than a man." The son had no answer. He shifted uncomfortably, for his father's words cut through the pride he had felt in bringing the Apache home. One afternoon, as the cowboy worked near the riverbed, he stumbled on a patch of quicksand. His boots sank deep, and before he could free himself, the ground began to pull him down. His horse panicked and bolted, leaving him struggling alone. The more he fought, the deeper he sank. Just when his strength was failing, a shadow appeared above him. The Apache had followed silently, watching from a distance. Without hesitation, he cut a sturdy branch, extended it, and pulled the cowboy free. The cowboy collapsed on solid ground, covered in mud but alive. For the first time, he looked the Apache in the eye and spoke with unguarded gratitude. "You saved me." That moment changed something between them. It was no longer about master and captive, nor about son and father. It was about survival, about one man choosing to help another when he could have walked away. The cowboy began to trust the Apache deeply, and the Apache, in turn, began to walk the ranch as if it were not a prison, but a place he could belong, even if only for a while. The days passed, each one weaving them closer together. The cowboy found himself learning more than he taught. He learned how to read the tracks of animals more sharply, how to find herbs that healed wounds, how to listen to the quiet signs of the land. He also learned patience to wait for trust to grow, to let respect rise slowly like the dawn after a long night. But outside the ranch, danger was brewing. Outlaws had been seen on the edges of town, men who robbed stagecoaches and burned homesteads. The sheriff was weak, unable to hold control. The townsfolk grew restless, and some even whispered that the Apache himself might turn against them in such lawless times. The cowboy knew these fears would not vanish easily. Yet deep inside, he began to believe that when true danger came, the young Apache would stand not as an enemy, but as an ally. The bond between them was still fragile, like a fire newly lit, but it burned with a quiet strength, and though neither man spoke of it, both sensed that the future would soon test whether this fragile trust could withstand the storms of the Wild West. The ranch had grown quieter in the weeks that followed, but the quiet did not last. Trouble always had a way of finding its path across the prairie, and soon whispers of raids reached the cowboys' ears. Stagecoaches were being held up, small ranches burned, and cattle stolen under the cover of night. The outlaws were bold, moving in groups armed and ruthless. Fear spread quickly among the townsfolk, and the sheriff, who was more talk than action, seemed unable to bring order. The people of the town looked at each other with worried eyes, wondering which homestead would fall next. The cowboy did not frighten easily, but he knew the danger was real. His ranch was isolated, and though his hands were steady, he was no longer young. Age had given him wisdom and caution, but his body no longer carried the speed it once did. He had lived through many fights, but each scar reminded him that survival depended on more than pride. It was in these moments of uncertainty that his gaze often turned toward the Apache. The young man moved with quiet alertness, always watching the horizon as if sensing storms before they came. One evening, as the cowboy was mending a fence post, he heard hoofbeats on the ridge. A group of riders appeared, dark shapes against the sunset. He froze, his hand tightening around the hammer in his grip. The riders did not approach, but their presence was clear. They were scouts testing the land, deciding which place would be easiest to take. The cowboy knew it was only a matter of time before they returned in greater numbers. Later that night, as the fire crackled in the cabin, he spoke to the Apache in slow words, mixing English with the few phrases he had learned from the young man's tongue. Men, bad men, coming. The Apache's dark eyes lifted from the firelight. He understood enough. He nodded once, his jaw tightening, and without a word he rose and went outside to check the perimeter of the ranch. His movements were careful, precise, like a man who had prepared for danger all his life. The cowboy's son was uneasy when he saw how much the father trusted the Apache. "Pa, you can't count on him when the time comes," he argued. "He's no kin to us. He'll run when bullets fly." The cowboy shook his head slowly. "A man shows who he is when it matters most. You'll see." The test came sooner than expected. A few nights later, under the cover of darkness, the raiders struck. The sound of horses thundered through the silence, followed by shouts and the crack of rifles. The cowboy jolted awake, grabbed his weapon, and rushed outside. Flames licked the edge of the barn where the outlaws had set fire to the dry hay. Bullets whizzed past as he returned fire, his old instincts sharp but his body straining. In the chaos he stumbled, his leg caught by a stray shot that grazed him and sent him crashing into the dirt. An outlaw rode straight toward him, revolver drawn, ready to finish the job. But before the cowboy could raise his rifle, the Apache appeared out of the shadows. With swift, fluid movements, he hurled a stone that struck the rider's arm, knocking the weapon from his hand. Then he leapt onto the horse, pulling the outlaw down and disarming him in one motion. The cowboy, struggling to his feet, watched in astonishment as the Apache fought with the skill of a man who had faced danger his entire life. There was no hesitation, no thought of running. Instead, he stood his ground, using the land to his advantage. He darted between shadows, struck quickly, and disappeared again before the outlaws could react. His knowledge of the terrain was unlike anything the raiders had expected. With the Apache's help, the cowboy and his son managed to push the raiders back. The fight was fierce, bullets sparking against the wooden posts and horses screaming into the night. But slowly the outlaws withdrew, cursing as they retreated into the darkness. The ranch was battered, the barn scorched, but it still stood. When the last echoes of hoofbeats faded, the cowboy lowered his rifle and turned to the Apache. Their eyes met in the dim glow of the fire. No words were spoken, but in that moment a bond was sealed. The cowboy had been saved not by his son, nor by the sheriff, but by the very man others called a captive. The next day, the townsfolk gathered to hear the tale. Some were skeptical. "He fought with you," one man scoffed. "Why wouldn't he just take his chance to escape?" But those who had seen the smoke rising from the ranch could not deny that something remarkable had happened. The cowboy stood firm in his account. "He could have run," he told them, his voice calm but commanding. "But he stayed, he fought. He saved my life." The son, too, had no choice but to accept what he had seen. He had doubted the Apache, but his own eyes had witnessed the courage that night. Though he said little, the doubt in his heart began to soften. Over the days that followed, the cowboy and the Apache worked side by side to rebuild. The barn was repaired with stronger beams, the fences reinforced. The cowboy's wound healed slowly, but his spirit seemed renewed. Each time he glanced at the Apache, he felt not only gratitude but respect. He began to see him less as a figure brought home by his son, and more as a man who had chosen to stay when it mattered most. In quiet moments, the cowboy wondered what thoughts filled the Apache's mind. Perhaps he could have left that night, slipping into the darkness while the raiders fled, but he had not. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps something deeper, the recognition of shared struggle, of two men bound not by chains but by survival in a land that tested all who lived upon it. At dusk, when the sky bled into shades of red and purple, the cowboy sometimes sat with the Apache near the corral. They spoke little, but words were not always needed. The silence between them carried meaning, a growing trust that did not require explanation. Yet even as the ranch grew stronger, danger still lurked beyond the horizon. The outlaws had been driven back, but not destroyed. They would return, and when they did, it would not be for cattle or coin alone. They would return for revenge. The cowboy knew it. The Apache knew it too. And somewhere deep in his heart, the cowboy felt certain that when that day came, he would not be facing it alone. The nights after the raid grew heavy with silence, yet it was the kind of silence that carried tension instead of peace. The cowboy sat on his porch most evenings, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. He knew the outlaws would not forget. Men like that did not walk away from defeat quietly. They would regroup, gather more numbers, and come back with vengeance burning in their hearts. The land was too wild and the law too weak to expect anything else. The Apache seemed to know this too. Each morning he rose before dawn and walked the boundaries of the ranch, studying the land as though it spoke to him. He examined the tracks of horses, the direction of the wind, the broken twigs that most men would overlook. The cowboy often watched him move, quiet as a shadow, and he realized this young man saw more in the land than he ever could. What seemed like empty desert to him was alive with signs and warnings for the Apache. The townsfolk had begun to whisper about the strange partnership. Some still mocked, but others had grown curious. They had seen the smoke from the raid, had heard the gunfire, and now they noticed that the cowboy's ranch still stood while others had fallen. A few came seeking advice, asking how he had managed to fight off so many men. The cowboy always gave the same answer: "I didn't do it alone." The sheriff, embarrassed by his own failures, tried to pretend the danger was under control, but the townspeople were not convinced. They began to look to the cowboy and the Apache as protectors, men who had already proven their courage. The weight of that responsibility settled on the cowboy's shoulders, but he did not shy away from it. He had lived long enough to know that when the law fails, men must rely on one another. One hot afternoon, as the sun baked the earth, the cowboy and the Apache rode out to scout the nearby canyon. The Apache stopped suddenly, raising his hand for silence. He crouched low, studying the ground. His sharp eyes had spotted tracks, fresh tracks. Horses, many of them, moving together. The cowboy knelt beside him, seeing only faint imprints in the dirt, but the Apache could read them like a book. He pointed west, then mimed the number 20 with his fingers. The cowboy understood. 20 men riding together and not far ahead. That night, the cowboy gathered the townsfolk in the saloon. The air was thick with smoke and fear. Men sat with their hats in their hands, listening as he spoke. "The raiders are close. They'll hit us soon. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. But they're coming. If we don't stand together, we'll lose everything." Some murmured in doubt, others nodded grimly. It was the Apache standing silently by the door who drew the most eyes. His presence unsettled some, but the cowboy raised his voice firmly. "He fought with me when they came before. He'll fight again. You can trust him." The decision was made. They would defend the town. For the first time, settlers and the Apache stood on the same side, bound not by friendship yet, but by necessity. The Apache showed them how to use the land to their advantage. He marked hiding places among rocks, pointed out high ground perfect for ambush, and taught them to move silently when they needed to. The townsfolk, who once doubted him, now listened closely, realizing that his knowledge might be the only thing that could save them. The next evening, the attack came. The outlaws rode in with torches and rifles, their leader shouting orders as they thundered into town. But this time the town was ready. From rooftops and windows, rifles cracked. From behind barrels and fences, men fired with steady hands. The Apache moved like a spirit, slipping through alleys, striking quick and hard. He shouted warnings in short English words, pointing out enemies before they struck. The cowboy, though slower than in his youth, stood tall in the center of the fight, his rifle booming with each shot. The battle raged through the night. Horses screamed, torches fell, buildings caught fire. The cowboy's son fought too, his fear burning away as he saw the Apache's courage firsthand. At one point, when the son was cornered by 2 raiders, the Apache appeared, tackling one and disarming the other before they could strike. For the first time, the young man shouted his thanks to him, his voice raw with realization that this was no enemy but a comrade. The turning point came when the outlaw leader charged straight into the heart of town, determined to break the defenders. He rode hard, a revolver in each hand, firing wildly. The townsfolk scattered in panic. The cowboy tried to raise his rifle, but his wounded leg slowed him. The leader aimed at him, grinning in cruel triumph. But before the shot could ring out, the Apache loosed an arrow from the shadows. It struck the outlaw's shoulder, knocking him from his horse. In the chaos that followed, the townsfolk surged forward, disarming the raiders and driving them into retreat. When dawn broke, the town lay battered but unbroken. Smoke rose from charred wood, and the ground was littered with spent shells. Yet the people stood together, weary but alive. They had faced the storm and survived. The cowboy, leaning on his rifle, turned to the Apache. His voice was hoarse but strong. "You're no captive. Not here, not anymore. You're my brother. The Apache's eyes softened, and for the first time since he had come to the ranch, he allowed the faintest trace of a smile to cross his face. The townsfolk, too, saw him differently now, no longer just a stranger or a burden. He was the man who had saved them when the law could not. Respect replaced suspicion, though some hearts still held prejudice. Change was slow in the West, but seeds had been planted. That night, as the town gathered around the fire to tend wounds and share food, the cowboy raised a cup high. We lived because we stood as one. Remember this day? His son, sitting nearby, nodded in agreement. He looked at the Apache with new eyes, ashamed of his earlier doubts. He had brought him home as a gift, not understanding what it meant to treat a man as property. Now he knew better. Gratitude filled his heart, not for the gift he thought he had given, but for the lesson his father and the Apache had shown him. The stars stretched wide above them, silent witnesses to what had been forged in fire and blood. The cowboy and the Apache sat side by side, no chains between them, no walls of mistrust left standing. The frontier was still wild, still dangerous, but together they had proven that even in a land ruled by violence and pride, respect could be earned, and brotherhood could be born. The dawn after the battle was unlike any the cowboy had seen in years. The town was still scarred, smoke rising from broken boards, fences shattered, and ashes scattered on the wind. But there was also a strange peace in the air. For the first time in a long while, the people walked the dusty street with their heads lifted, not bowed in fear. They had survived, and more than that, they had fought back together. The cowboy leaned on the post outside the saloon, his legs still stiff from the fight, watching the people move with quiet pride. The Apache stood nearby, his arms folded across his chest. His face, as always, was steady and calm, but his presence was different now. No one dared look at him as a captive anymore. Even those who once whispered against him now gave him nods of respect, hesitant but genuine. Children peeked at him, from behind their mothers' skirts, not with fear but with curiosity. He had become something more than an outsider. He was part of the story of their survival. The cowboy's son approached him, still bruised from the battle but with fire in his eyes. He hesitated before speaking, as though struggling with words he had never thought he would say. "Pa," he began softly. "I was wrong." His gaze flicked toward the Apache. "When I brought him here, I thought I was giving you something to make your life easier. I didn't see him for what he truly is. He's no gift, no possession. He's a man. And he's saved us all." The cowboy rested a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice low but firm. "We all learn in time. It's not shameful to be wrong. The shame is in refusing to see the truth once it's shown to you." His son nodded, the weight of his father's wisdom settling heavy but steady on him. That afternoon, the townsfolk gathered in the square. The sheriff, trying to reclaim some dignity, announced that the raiders had been driven away for good. He gave credit to the townspeople for their bravery, but every eye turned to the cowboy and the Apache. It was clear to all who had truly led them through the fire. When the meeting ended, the cowboy stood before the crowd. His voice carried across the square, rough but strong. "He's no slave," he said, nodding toward the Apache. "He owes none of us anything. He chose to fight beside us when he could have walked away. From this day on, he's free. More than that, he's my friend, and I'll stand beside him as he stood beside me." There was silence at first, then murmurs of agreement. A few even clapped their hands against their hats, a show of respect in the old frontier way. Slowly, the people accepted it. They might not have fully understood the bond between the EEI, cowboy, and the Apache, but they could not deny the truth of it. In the days that followed, the Apache made no move to leave. He worked the land with the cowboy, helped rebuild the ranch, and even began teaching the sun skills of the earth that no book or teacher could explain. He showed him how to find water where the ground seemed dry, how to track an animal across miles of rock, how to listen to the wind and the birds to know when danger lurked. The son, who once saw him as less than himself, now listened with respect. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, the cowboy sat with the Apache near the corral. They shared a quiet meal, the air heavy with the smell of fresh bread and stew. After a long silence, the cowboy spoke. "You don't have to stay," he said softly. You're free to go where you please. But if you choose to stay, know that this place is as much yours as it is mine." The Apache looked at him, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then he nodded once firmly. "I stay," he said in slow, careful English. The cowboy smiled faintly, feeling a warmth spread through him. It was not the smile of victory, nor of ownership, but of understanding. Two men, from worlds apart, had chosen to stand side by side. As weeks turned into months, the legend of the cowboy and the Apache spread. Travelers passing through town carried the story farther along the frontier. They spoke of how a middle-aged rancher, once alone and weary, had found an unlikely companion in a man he was never meant to call his equal. They spoke of how the two had fought together, saved a town, and changed the minds of those who once doubted. In a land full of violence and division, their story was rare, and it shone like a lantern in the dark. For the cowboy, life settled into a rhythm again, but it was not the same as before. Where once he had felt the loneliness of empty nights, now he had company. The Apache worked beside him, not as servant, but as brother. The son, too, grew wiser, seeing his father's lessons not as old words but as living truth. Together, the three of them built something stronger than a ranch. They built trust, respect, and a sense of belonging that even the Wild West could not easily tear apart. One quiet morning, as they rode out together across the prairie, the cowboy looked out at the horizon. The land stretched wide, endless and untamed, just as it always had. But for the first time in many years, he did not feel small against it. He felt part of it, tied not by blood alone, but by bonds forged in fire and in choice. He turned to the Apache riding beside him, their horses moving in rhythm. No words were needed. The silence between them spoke of battles fought, lives saved, and futures yet to come. The cowboy's son rode slightly behind, watching the two men ahead of him. In his heart, he knew he was witnessing something that would shape his own life forever. He had grown up believing strength was measured in what you owned. Now he knew the truth, that real strength was found in honor, in respect, and in standing by those who chose to stand by you. The prairie wind blew strong, carrying dust and promise alike. The cowboy, the Apache, and the sun rode together into the horizon, their shadows stretching long across the golden land. They were no longer master and captive, no longer strangers divided by blood or past. They were men of the West, bound not by chains but by choice, and their story would live as long as the wild frontier itself.